So we'll do introductions as we go. It's going to be a bit of a roundtable, and we don't have a lot of time. So each of us will kind of introduce ourselves as we go along. We're telling some stories from our experience building VA.gov as a decoupled Drupal site. And I'm going to start with just a quick overview of the use of the case study. We're going to talk a little bit about and some of the challenges we face, some of the learnings we've had there. Ben's going to discuss some editorial experience work that we've been doing recently. And then we'll turn it over to John to talk about some of the DevOps, some of the ways we've handled DevOps, and Elijah as well, daily deployments. So without further ado, we should talk for about 8 minutes. That should leave us about 10 minutes for Q&As at the end. Please go ahead, leave questions now. We'll see if we can do as we go, but we may just leave some of them for the Q&As at the very end. All right, so my name's Kevin Walsh. I'm product manager on this product right now. I was a UX engineer last year on the project and did a lot of the content model work, some of the content strategy work. This project has been a partnership at VA with 3 firms, Agile 6, Civic Actions, and Nava. Nava's not represented on the call today, but they were a big part of this. And just want to start a little bit with a little bit of overview about VA. Most of you are familiar with it, but it is the second largest government department. It has 3 wings, each of which are the size of a large federal agency. VHA, which is the biggest one, which is the healthcare side. The VBA, which is the other benefits other than healthcare, such as education, housing, disability, and cemeteries. And just to give you an idea of scale, this is the largest integrated healthcare system in the US. We'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll go back about 6 or 7 years here, history of the digital modernization efforts that have been happening. So most people are familiar with what happened with healthcare.gov launch. The very next priority after that fiasco was VA. A couple other agencies as well, but VA was kind of identified as number 1. The first thing to launch out of that was vets.gov. Well, maybe not the first thing. One of the first things to launch out of that effort was vets.gov, which was the first site to bring a kind of a human-centered design and agile approach to vets. That was then actually retired 3 years ago, and the lessons from that, basically an MVP, were then incorporated into the relaunch of a new VA.gov. So everything was unified into VA.gov, which was the original kind of flagship site. But it's really exactly the same time as Drupal introduced to this ecosystem. So we started up in fall 2018, right? Exactly the same time as the new VA.gov was launched. And then in the spring, we launched our first product out of Drupal, which was the healthcare part of the benefit content. And then throughout the year, we worked on products, most significantly the VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System, which is a hospital website. And it's the pilot for 150 more healthcare systems. And that's really, the VA is a bricks and mortar organization, and it's really through these facilities, these buildings, that veterans are accustomed to getting their services. Big focus on the facilities, and there's over 2,000 facilities at VA. And that's the way that it's through Drupal that this modernization experience will scale to vets with really the equivalent of hundreds of websites. A little bit about the ecosystem at VA right now. There's something called the Digital Experience Product Office, which grew out of US Digital Services, but it's now embedded within VA. There's dozens of product teams that are all using human-centered design, agile, and DevOps to build and deploy products for vets. Very much a focus on getting things out the door. Products can be launched in a matter of weeks. Most recently, a COVID screener tool 2 weeks after the project started. And the whole idea there is launch and learn. So big emphasis on shipping. So I'll step into some very light tech stuff here, and there'll be a lot later on about that. But when we showed up, VA.gov was being generated with Metalsmith, and it still is. It's a static site generator with daily deploys. And the source of the was a GitHub repo of Markdown files. Markdown files that had a lot of HTML in them, actually, quite a bit of front matter for some content and some metadata, and then some good old Markdown. So, very rapid way of developing content and deploying, and it worked really well within this ecosystem of dozens of product teams collaborating. But obviously, that's not going to scale, and it's using GitHub isn't for everybody at VA for managing content. So in our sort of first phase, Drupal started to coexist with those markdowns. We, primarily Beth Jacobson, who's going to be talking in a second, was doing a lot of migration of those markdown files into Drupal. And GraphQL was added as a means of accessing that content for Mailsmith. But those two continued to coexist for a period. And then Drupal eventually kind of nudged that markdown repo out and became the source of truth for this flagship content. So by flagship content, it's the main content by which vets learn about their benefits, how to apply for them, and so on, managing. More recently, we started to integrate the content API from Drupal is now serving API.va.gov, both with GraphQL and some push with the Drupal Q API. That is an API, a set of APIs really that can serve a number of different front ends, including VA.gov, a few React components, and there's some other potential front ends that are coming out of that as well. So kind of starting to serve multiple consumers through an API clearinghouse of sorts. Okay, now I'll switch to sort of challenges because I think that's what people want to hear about. First of all, in this context of dozens of product teams working together in an agile and kind of ship-first mentality, designing a content model that's going to scale for an enterprise for one of the largest agencies is not a straightforward process. There's been a lot of kind of give and take there. We've had to focus on shipping as much as possible, but we're trying to keep our eye on the long-term big picture at VA. So that's been a challenge. Got a graphic to demonstrate some of that. This big red box is one of the big products that we're serving, which is that healthcare system product. And then we've got a set of kind of core content types, what we call core content that are serving potentially multiple different products in the future. And so we've kind of got a roadmap of what are coming down the pipeline and try to make sure that we're not doing anything that's going to get us in trouble later on and not having like 300 content types. So that's been a challenge, ongoing challenge, and interesting to work with different product teams who aren't used to the content model part of designing products. Second big challenge, the VA.gov, the static front end is deployed on a daily basis as our CMS code deploys, which we'll be talking about. But of course, editors of a CMS are used in publishing, and the current existing static site generated does not do instant publishing, and it still doesn't. So we're still faced with this challenge. It's ongoing. There's a few different teams in our ecosystem that are working on this, of getting our content releases out faster, which is required for scaling. And then finally, editorial experience. The Drupal editorial experience, of course, is not designed for decoupled sites out of the box. And when we're with a big emphasis on vets first, this has not always been our top priority, unfortunately. We're highly committed to it, and we've done quite a bit there, but there's still a long way to go. And I'm going to turn it over to Susan to talk a little bit about one of the ways that we've been doing that recently. Shoot, I just saw challenge 1 slide. Am I stuck? Can everyone see challenge 3 right now? Okay. Great. Thanks, Ralph. All right, Beth, over to you. I'm going to mute.
Okay. Thanks. So I'm Beth Jacobson. I also work for Civic Actions, and as Kev said, I did some of the initial migration for the new VA Drupal site. More recently, I came back on the VA and did some work on the editorial experience. So proofing is, like Kev said, always a problem with decoupled sites. Our initial solution was actually to query out to the front end and bring back a live version of the page that we wanted to preview so that people could see the drafts before they published and see exactly what they would look like on the front end. That was great for our users, but there's some disadvantages too. One of the advantages of a decoupled site is that you can present the content in many different places in many different ways. And our preview system only privileged the website. That's still the main way that this information gets out, but as different apps and different things come online, that's no longer going to be sufficient. Next slide. So we decided to move and to start making more use of the Drupal view screen by creating a proofing experience within that. And Kev, if you'll stop sharing, I'll go ahead and share that screen so that people can see what's going on. Okay, so here's a typical VA.gov page. It's got the title, some intro text, what we call featured content, bunch of questions and answers, some tables. And here's what it looks like in our new proofing setup. So at the top, we have the metadata, which of course isn't visible on the screen, but important. And then the title, the page intro. This looks basically like what you would see. One difference though, because we used paragraphs for some semantic information and also to make it easy for them to add in the VA component library. We wanted to have a way to see what was really going on while you're proofing the page. So here on the right corner, we have the names of the various paragraphs being used here. And each one is nested so that, for example, you can see this is a Q&A section. And all three of these Q&As are within that single Q&A section. We come down here, what on the actual site just looks like a question and a button. Here we see that that's actually a React widget. And that's another thing we did so that people can select a React widget in Drupal. And it gets displayed, replaced by an actual widget on the front end. So you can see here that semantically this React widget actually belongs as part of the answer to this question. Another one of the advantages of doing it this way is that we can expose even information like this that wouldn't be visible on the homepage, for instance, or on the live site. This error message won't normally show up and hopefully will never show up, but it's something that the editors can control. And that makes it useful if we want to do comparisons. We have revisioning diff set up so that people, if they make changes to a published page, can see the changes that they've made before they go ahead and publish their drafts. So here too, we can see we have all this internal information. And in this case, they removed the word benefit, which is very clear. So a content editor, once they've made their changes, can just browse the screen, make sure all the changes they wanted are actually here, and they didn't accidentally make other changes that they didn't intend to. I think that's most of what I wanted to cover here. I did want to talk a little bit about components, because there are a number of components that the VA site uses. So we've kind of represented them. On the front end, this would be a really fancy numbered list, and here we call that out. Again, just identifying the paragraph type up here, but also showing what the numbered list looks like here. In some cases, there are accordions. So we make this look a bit like an expanded accordion. And that's actually another one of the advantages of having a proofing page over the actual preview page. So this is what another preview page would look like. And say there was a directive that we want to highlight all the TTYs on the page. If I search here for TTY, so there looks like, yeah, there's just one on the page and then one in the footer. But if I look on the proofing screen, now I see there's one that is hidden inside of this alert. And if I keep going, there's another one in the second alert, the one we originally found, and another one that's hidden underneath this accordion. So by opening everything up on the proofing page, we make it a little easier for people to search and browse. And we're hoping this will make just an easier proofing experience for the content editors. And I think that's it for me, so I'll go ahead and pass it on to John.
Chapter 3. Is that what everyone sees? Okay. All right. So when I came in, it was really the main challenge was don't break the build. There was the decoupled process was very decoupled. Right? As Kevin said, the web project existed well before the Drupal came along. And so they treated the Drupal content really as just another data source. So they weren't fully ready to commit to Drupal as like source of truth. They had all these other content sources that they were also compiling into their build. And so what ended up happening was the web had their own dev test live process. They had their own PRs on a different system, but dev test and live inside their build release process ran a full kind of web build. It would pull content at that time from CMS, as well as the Markdown and all the other sources that you were talking about. But that happened like at exact build time. And it also happened from dev to dev, test to test, live to live. So there was a web build stack, there was a web stack with dev test live and a Drupal stack with dev test live, completely separate. And so there was really no telling, essentially, the CMS would just get hit and pull the content. And so there was all this instability because the Drupal site was being developed quickly as well. Not only that, but the DevOps was kind of being rolled out as we went. So there was VA.gov AWS.gov cloud requirements that were separated it from. The two servers were separated by a network. They needed a proxy, meaning the web builder and the Drupal CMS. Sometimes the site wouldn't respond because of any number of reasons. And then sometimes it was GraphQL specifically. Sometimes the GraphQL worked, but it crashed with memory errors because the content was too much. Sometimes it errored because of a schema change. Sometimes it errored for any number of other reasons. The problem was the web build process was happening on a completely separate Jenkins server. So the Drupal team had no idea what errors were actually happening at the time. And the web team, effectively, since the DevOps for the Drupal site was still early and all of these technical issues were making it look like to them that the site was not reliable. So they coded around it. They were a totally separate team. So they actually coded into the JavaScript build process, like this just completely unbreakable build. The Drupal site was an environment URL. It would try to load the content from there. If it wasn't available on the network, it would use old content. If it errored, it would use old content. If the GraphQL errored, it would use old content. If there was a bad schema, just a simple field change, it would use old content. All this was happening without kind of the CMS's knowledge. And so it was a consistent problem that the public production deployment would actually send out old content. And it wasn't until we unified these build processes that we finally figured out why that was even happening. It was even hard to figure out. We learned more and more about the web build by doing this, and learned that we didn't even know how much caching it was doing until we started to unify this process. So what do? We said, hey, you're a JavaScript project, but we have this really great dependency management tool called Composer, right? So we got them to actually submit a Composer JSON file for VA.gov/web so that we, on Drupal side, could do Composer require VA.gov web. And what that means is that we could actually pin the exact version of that decoupled site, the vet's website repo, install it along with the composer install process, and then test the whole thing. And then we could even send out test results based to the commit. So for the first time, we could actually have the web code and the CMS code running in the exact same spot against the same exact commits. So we could reliably kind of test code to code. An interesting side effect of this was to create this node project type. So I don't know, I'm kind of thinking about this as a model for decoupled sites, because you're always needing to develop two things at once, or it's a very common use case. To Git repos, there's never really alignment. So we're thinking that because the decoupled space is getting more and more common, we can have like a node project and it knows where to put it. So it puts it in the /web folder here. Other tools that we needed to solve this puzzle was the composer install post install command. To save time and to also just be able to make it automated, we hooked into composer installs itself. So when you run composer install, it's doing a lot of Drupal stuff and Git hooks, but down here, it kicks off to this VA web install command. This is the exact same code that the NPM project uses. So we basically emulated the web build process inside our composer install process. This is the NPM, this is the yarn install command. I forgot to scroll this over because there's it's totally similar. Node.js and PHP. You've got the install process, which just deals with the code, the source code, scaffolds all the dependencies. NPM install, yarn is used often. That's just the source code, but then we go and we get also build, which Composer doesn't have like a standard way to do this, but in Drupal, you would call it the install process or the build process. The VA web build command we created assumes there is an actual Drupal site available. This is pretty cool. Once we had this in process, we were able to wrap it with some extra things. Like, for example, how do you tell the content editors that there's a build happening? A config set. So we created a little thing that sets a variable so that a message can be shown in the front end to the developers, or content editors rather, saying, hey, your content's being built in this backend build process. It does a little cleanup. It does extra stuff, like we couldn't get around getting these assets. We needed extra content, etc. The yarn build process needed this node environment variable, but we were very easily able to just add that here instead of worrying about, environments and Dockers and all these other things. We could just drop it right into Composer as a variable to try to get the thing to work, to make sure that no matter what you did, Composer VA web build would actually build the entire front end from the site you're running it within. Like that was one of the biggest things was there was no like site-centric build process. So this command always looked and hit against whether it's the local development environment or the CI environment or production. And so we really started to tease out exactly what we needed. And then at the end, drush config, it's done. And so this is just a composer in the composer scripts list. It's just anything you add here creates a composer command. And so it's a very helpful way this is core what DevOps is all about to me, is giving the developers control over these operations. So highly recommend to kind of like use it to bridge the gap between NPM and Composer. And then the final big solution of the puzzle was actually getting the environments, the CI sites to do this, right? Because without PR, without putting the web in the CI, in the PR environments, there was no testing. Like Drupal PR site would fire up on a branch, but it would just use the main branch, it would use the main web. It would actually, I think at first they were all pinging. They didn't reach out to the web build process at all. The web dev site simply reached the CMS dev site, right? And so there was no automated way to build the front end and test it. And so what ended up happening was the schema changes didn't even get read by web build until they were merged. So it was like they were merged and put to dev, and then we found out, the web build wasn't able to consume the new content. And so to solve this, we were able to, with the Composer install and the Composer VA web build, Composer VA web build just became another update hook. So we unified our CI by linking in web, and so that every single Git push does a new site, does composer install, which kicks off the front end builds install, and then when the database comes in and it tests the deployment part, which is like your update database cache clear, it does another web build. And so this way we had like full CI for every single step of the process end to end. And it wasn't until that point that we really finally even could start to identify why there were all these incompatibilities and why the build was unstable. So real quick, some interesting solutions were coding the web build script to output to just simply /static, because it turns out every Drupal server can also host a node project if it's just HTML. So we dumped all the static HTML right into /static, and no matter what tool we were using, Lando, DevShop, Drupal VM, and then even in production, it would all go right into static, and we didn't need to worry about a node container or any of this other stuff. It's just because it's hosted by Apache, serves HTML perfectly well. So we were able to test in any environment. We could just go to /static, and boom, there was the associated front end. We did an Apache config trick, which allowed not just /static doesn't always work for your relative roots and stuff. So we actually did we figured out the exact Apache config with a little bit of regex to create a second virtual host for every CI site. And so we had PR123 and then PR123.web. And so that way we knew we had a predictable URL pattern for one site, but 2 URLs. And then one last thing that I was able to add was the use case was if someone's editing a node or editing a blog or inside the site somewhere, how do they get to the static version of that page? And so I kind of came up with a simple REST format class. It's in custom code right now, but this might be useful for contrib. All it does is it's the same thing that you see for like format REST or format XML or format JSON. Format static HTML, all it does is look up if there is an index file and loads it and returns it. And so this way it kind of unified the Drupal site itself. So we had like the node, the Drupal admin UI page, because the entire thing was admin. We should mention, I don't think that was mentioned yet. The entire CMS is backend. There's no theme at all. It's all just Drupal admin pages, but the URLs always matched. So since they used the URLs for the content, both in the CMS and the front end, you could jump from back and forth to each other with this little format static HTML thing. So I think the key takeaways here were just like make it all, you got to get these things together or you're going to end up with instabilities, and that's it. Pretty much it.
Right on time.
Also, I wanted to point out, I wasn't sure if anybody mentioned it, this is all open source repos and links, and there's VA even maintains their own GitHub IO documentation on how to launch VA.gov locally. So we'll show you all that later. That's Elijah.
All right. My name's Elijah Lynn, and a little bit about my background. I started off as using Drupal actually for site building in maybe like 2008, 2009. And crazy story is that Kevin Walsh here, Civic Actions, used to work for Dr. Furman, and we had hired Civic Actions about 2009-ish, something like that, and actually hired Kevin to work on, I think it was the Nutritional Research Institute or something like that. And full circle, I ended up on this project with Kevin Walsh after like many years, and I wasn't even the Drupal developer like at the time. I was just basically a project manager at the time. Really, I thought that was really trippy to be on here with you, and I love working with Kevin. So great stuff, and everyone else too. So I ended up switching from kind of site building and things to really doing Drupal full time in about 2012. I worked at NBC Universal for 4 years, and I was part of the New York City and New Jersey Drupal communities. It's kind of where I got my roots, going to meetups and all that stuff. And then I just was a software engineer then, and then I moved to doing DevOps at Red Hat and doing DevOps with Drupal, specifically for www.redhat.com, Drupal 7 site. And the reason I say this is because I have done basically like 6 years, I think, of the traditional agile. I shouldn't say traditional for some people, but in my world, 6 years of every 2 weeks we do a deploy. And is, as we all kind of hear about this every now and then, and we kind of say, Well, we hear about all these daily deployments and, how do we get there and all that stuff. And I'm not going to talk so much about the how of doing daily deploys. I want to say like the what and a little bit about the story. I don't have a ton of time here. So, but I've been on the other end of doing 2-week deployments, and now that we've got to daily deploys, like I don't ever want to be on a project again without daily deployments. It is a game changer. It is very important for a decoupled site, I think. You're both making changes so quickly, and you can't wait 2 weeks to ship something. And if you don't have that kind of mindset of this flow of just being able to do a release, like you're going to end up in a spot where you're afraid. It's fear. It's oh, I got to build this thing up, and it's this brittle kind of thing, and you're maybe making hotfix branches, things like that. So yeah. So to reiterate, this site is basically the CMS is Drupal 8 site. It's for www.va.gov. It's a static site. I want to reiterate. I didn't think we covered that as much, so I want to just hit on this. It's static. This site is hosted in S3. It's actually in an S3 bucket. There's an index.html file in it, and in every single folder, basically, if you go to / any path / whatever. So it's hosted out of S3. It's just a static site. There is some dynamic parts of the site that are React widgets, and they reach out to an API.va.gov endpoint. We don't control that endpoint. We're just the content store for this static site build that happens on a daily basis. All the teams are on a daily deployment, like best practice. As we came onto the project, we did a 2-week sprint deployment. That was our default motto. That's what we all knew. Everybody was comfortable with that, and we did that for a while. And towards as we got closer to the end of our initial contract, it was expected that we were to switch to this daily deployment model. And the big things of these daily deployments are you merge 1 or 2 PRs a day, and when you actually do a release, you have so much less risk. There's so much less risk by doing a daily deployment. And with a decoupled model where the front end is also doing daily deployments, and you're both doing things, that is the way to do it. And we do a scheduled daily deployment, meaning it's going to go out at 2:30 Eastern for the front end build, and then the CMS follows by an hour. And we have a message that goes out in the Slack channel. It's kind of like this different, if you think about it, it's going out, it notifies the teams, it says, hey, we're going to do this deploy. You can cancel it if you want to, and it gives a 60-minute warning. All the teams have this. It's like a 60-minute warning. And that way you can go and actually cancel the job if you don't want to go out. Something's not going to work out that day. It's totally fine to do that. But the default is to deploy on a daily basis, not the other way around. So anyway, we started with the 2 weeks, and to actually get the U.S. digital service is our little bubble that we're in right now. Not all of VA is in this model right now, but I'm just going to show you real quick. We go to, let's see that tab. If you search the internet for U.S. digital service playbook, oh, this is a side tangent. I was just in my notes, so I'm going to go with it for a second. I want to just highlight this one thing. U.S. digital services playbook, play 13, default to open. If you do not open source something, you actually, it says something like,
could you maximize that and make it bigger so we can see it?
Sure. How's that?
It's fine. If you want to zoom in a little more to focus on what you're talking about, it'd be helpful.
Yeah. Anyways, just publish open source code. I just wanted to highlight that from John's thing, and then what data sets? No, if the code base has not been released under open source, explain why. So the model is kind of flipped, default to open, literally. Anyways, let's see, where was I going with this? So the U.S. Digital Service, I know I'm like right at time, but I started a minute or two late, so I'm going to go 1 or 2 minutes. The U.S. Digital Service gave us that mandate, and we had to figure out how to get there. And so part of the thing was more of like a mental thing, but I'm going to say squash and merge is all the repos have disabled, like with the other tradition, there's like 3 methods in GitHub. The one how to do this is squash and merge. Squash and merge takes all your commits, puts them as bulleted items in a commit message, and creates an actual commit, not a merge commit. There's a few different things. If you've ever ended up Googling how to revert a revert, you'll know that you're in like this revert hell in Git world, and I can do it totally fine, but it's not easy to automate, and it's not easy. Like once you merge something in, if you did break something, there's a revert button on all the PRs that you can just hit revert. It makes it PR. And then you don't have to deal with the whole like lingering commits issue and all that stuff. So squash and merge, every commit turns up as one commit, and GitHub actually puts the issue ID in the commit message. So you can still click it when you're looking at commit history, and you can still get all that contextual goodness, which, to be honest, we all left so much good information in PRs anyways that were not in commit messages about why things were done a certain way. So it's actually like, I was a little bit resistant in the beginning, but then I got it, and I was like, this makes sense. And so really big deal. And then we ended up doing it, and we're on daily deploys now. And we can also just do one-off deploys if we want to. Like it's pretty quick. So that's the story of like this and how it fits in with the decoupled model. It's a static site build, and even if it's not static site, highly recommend this. This is the way. And I was so grateful. I didn't have to manage up. I didn't have to say, hey, I really want to do this. This is the way. This was like a directive given to us by U.S. Digital Service. That's just huge. The type of culture and team we are on is like a really great bubble to be in inside our United States government. We're doing the commitment to open source is just huge. When we make open source contributions, the VA product teams are like, this is amazing. This is great. They're excited that we made open source Drupal contributions. It's really an exciting and promising thing to see the future of our government. I'll end here.
Sorry, Elijah, just a quick time check. We only have 7 minutes, 7 or 8 minutes left.
I just want to end. We are hiring another Drupal engineer role soon for this project. So if anybody's interested, email me at elijah.lin@agile6, numeral 6, agile6.com. And we'll end with this. Thank you, everyone. And if you guys all want to open up your mics again, and now we're going to have an open discussion.
And we can also just FYI on the hop-in, people, if they want to ask a question face-to-face instead of in chat, you can click request to share video up there.
Yeah, Elijah, maybe you can like kill your screen share.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize. There we go. Sorry, done.
Elijah asking if there's you can share a link to the job post for the Drupal engineer position. Civic Actions will also be.
So if anybody has questions, they can post it in text chat if they want. Face-to-face, if they want.
Kevin, do you want to shout out like how to contact for hiring or like your?
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, Agile 6 hiring is priority for the Drupal. Civic Actions will be following along as well. So, civicactions.com/careers.
So I saw a question. I'm in Whitehall, New York, and this is the actual hull of the Ticonderoga. And they claim to be the birthplace of the Navy. This is the earliest ships, revolutionary 1812 stuff. So I happen to be here, and I figured, hey, why not present about the VA in front of a warship?
That is a good backdrop, I gotta admit. Okay, got a question from
performance of Drupal.
Yeah.
Performance meaning like system performance, because we could go on and on about GraphQL. GraphQL crashing, running 2 minutes per query to load a whole site was no bueno. So like, I don't know if that's the question, but performance became a very big issue once the content started scaling. All that huge, it was doing one large query for the whole build process off GraphQL, and it became very inefficient very quick.
Yeah, that I think that, so like ultimately that came with like loading 500 or 600 nodes with entity references. So it's like totaling, 10,000 entity references you're trying to load at once. So it's this massive amount of database queries. We are actually moving to a new system based off TomeSync right now. And it basically exports all the content and keeps it up. It's on disk. And then when the request comes in, the front end build actually we actually tar it up on a fast SSD and it responds within like half second. So like all the content is, it has other issues. It's almost like a talk in itself. But I
was going to say, Elijah should do a whole talk on this. If anybody's heard of Tome, promote this project. Tome.fyi is a Drupal command line tool that takes the entire thing and dumps every single node to JSON exports. Right, and so this was like a kind of a revolution because, like, of course, Node.js Metalsmith can load JSON files, and it can do it much faster. Thank you, Jesus, for the link. Yeah, like Elijah said, they were like, wait, we just run this command, it exports every single node as JSON, and they tar it up and send it over. Then we don't have to worry about, the web team doesn't have to worry about the website at all. We just deliver them content, static file-wise.
Yeah.
So
the main thing with this is that every time you do a deployment, you have to do a re-export because schema changes. So we're kind of shuffling stuff around there so that we still serve the old export. It's another talk, but just that's kind of the direction we're heading because GraphQL. Yeah.
I can probably take Brittany's question the next minute or hopefully. We have prioritized content editor experience where possible. Within the whole paragraphs approach, we're using Paragraphs browser, for example, this visual kind of library of different components you can use and try to make things as visual as possible in that experience. The biggest initiative recently we call EWA, which is editorial workflow and assignments. So we're using content moderation, Drupal content moderation as a editorial workflow, managing things from draft to published, archived, and so on. And I guess the best way to describe this quickly is we're sort of taking a bunch of the GitHub UI and workflow, which some of the editors were used to when they were editing Markdown files, and applying it within content moderation in Drupal. So that involves the ability to assign content to each other, to set due dates around things, to leave additional messages. There's a whole, one of the nice things about Decoupled is that it frees up that proofing screen that Beth demoed. And I don't think, she didn't point at it, but the right rail there, we're used as like a content dashboard for individual pieces of content. So you can show a lot of metadata related to the content there as well, like workflow, revision log history. It's actually the revision logs. So concept we refer now as content traceability. That's kind of a big deal when you've got like sometimes dozens of lawyers reviewing content for compliance, being able to see all the changes that have come in and by different editors at different points. So that's a big one, is the whole content dashboards with editorial workflow and assignments built into that. And then I think the other thing is, of course, content dashboards, building dashboards for different products. And we've got kind of a one-size-fit-all dashboard mentality right now. What we're trying to do is, because we're serving so many different products with different editors, and even within each product, I've always thought this about Drupal. Drupal's never a single product. It's always like 10 products mashed together. And this has never been more true in my experience than a VA, where you've got very different user segments using. And so a big focus now will be segmenting our users and building custom dashboards for different use cases and different types of folks. So for content findability, top tasks, researching and identifying top tasks for different types of users. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Brittany.